Welcome to another Backyard Professor video series. I'm going to discuss the Shema with you tonight. There's some interesting information we need to understand about the Shema. Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 and 5. I have several scholarly articles by J. Gerald Jansen and Norman Nagel and several other scholars on the various aspects of the Shema and what it means. There's a very important article, The Yoke of the Kingdom, an exposition of Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 and 5 by S. Dean McBride Jr. that I have. He's an associate professor of the Old Testament at the Yale University Divinity School. Many different articles, scholarly analysis, Harold M. Schulweis on Echad, unifying the predicates of divinity, so on and so forth. When we study the biblical scholarship on the Shema, we see that it's not describing, Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 and 5 is not about the number of God. It is not about the ontological nature of God at all. That is taking it out of context. Many critics are quoting the Shema to me saying, this proves the council of the gods is a false doctrine. And so I want to explore this just a little bit. And of course, the Shema is one of the most important scriptures for the Jews, as they recite it twice when they begin their day, once when they begin their day, once when they end their day in their prayers. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. That's one possible translation, not the only one, and not necessarily the best one either. Jansen notes, as all the scholars do, that one of the possible translations is Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. And his context of the Shema is as a covenant context. This is interesting and worth looking at. In his article on the most important word in the Shema in the Vetus Testamentum for 1987, Jansen discusses this idea of, is this translation supposed to say Yahweh is our unique God, Yahweh alone, or is he one? And he contends that those who propose this is an ontological aspect of deity, that this scripture is trying to describe the ontological reality of God, are missing or misinterpreting the actual context of what this is talking about. This context is what I want to explore with you, because it actually coincides with the Council of the Gods context, with the Council of the Gods setting forth their decrees, and with Israel ignoring those decrees and not allowing God into their lives, so to speak. His analysis using Hosea, Job, and other scriptures is extremely interesting for me. Now, on page 280 of his article, Jansen indicates that he says, biblical scholars have asserted the need to disentangle the interpretation of the Shema from the concerns of the explicitly monotheistic philosophy or theology of a later age. Notice this. The early Israelites were not concerned about describing monotheism. This came from a later age. Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 and 5 is not a monotheistic statement, in other words. He says, they have analyzed the Shema in the context of Israel's covenant traditions. And in such a construal as the covenant traditions, the opening sentence contains not so much an affirmation to Israel about Yahweh, but what the Shema is actually about is a claim upon Israel for exclusive covenant loyalty to Yahweh. He says that on page 280 of his article. It's this covenant loyalty that the Shema is discussing, and the actual meaning from the Deuteronomist side of things. That is the original setting that Jansen sets out to find. And it has nothing to do with monotheism. that is for a later age. The critics who are using the Shema against the theme of the Council of the Gods are absolutely wrong. They are not understanding the proper biblical context because, of course, as usual, they haven't consulted the necessary biblical scholarship. Jansen is not the only one that proposes this interpretation. There's many others that I'll use. I mean, I have at least a dozen articles here that I've collected through the various scholarly journals, Interpretation and Vetus Testamentum and so on and so forth, that I want to discuss this Shema with you. Jansen says he wants to explore this idea of Yahweh is one in a way that avoids the importation of anachronistic philosophical and theological concerns. The theme of oneness of God and Israel is squarely based upon Israel's religious history and at the heart of the covenant traditions between Israel and God. He says his argument with the idea of the oneness of God is that the claim is for Israel to love Yahweh, its God, with all of its heart, soul, and strength. And in turn, the affirmation to Israel is that Yahweh is Echad, that is one. The purpose of this affirmation is to identify in God the dependable ground upon which an exhortation to wholehearted loyalty may appropriately be made. Well, here we go. I'm being interrupted by a helicopter. Meow. Nobody's going to leave me alone to make this video uninterrupted. There's a gajillion cars around here and helicopters and all sorts of fun flying machines going on. All I want to do is make a video, people. Would you please just go home so you can leave me alone and video this beautiful sunset? Holy cow. Now, one fascinating thing the scholars have noted about this Shema is that it is actually a mirror image of the Decalogue. That is, the Ten Commandments. The Shema reflects the theme of the first part of the Decalogue. And he quotes Patrick D. Miller on this, which I think is exquisitely interesting how he puts the two themes together. It is as the God who sets an afflicted and an enslaved people free that the Lord creates and claims a relationship with the people. This is the theme, the relationship. The single ground for identifying the Lord and explaining why that one claims to be your God is the clause who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That is to say, the demands of the covenant are rooted in the affirmation of the identity and the character of the God who establishes Israel as a nation. This theme is exquisitely interesting. He says that on page 281. The covenant in the Shema and the Decalogue, being the mirror of the first part of the Decalogue, this identifies the character of the covenanting God as one. Not numerically, but with a fidelity to keep Israel as his people. This is the theme of the Shema. And the way it covers the identity of Israel's God, his character, is the summing up in the narrative of Yahweh's deliverance from Egypt. The narrative here implies Yahweh's unity in the form of fidelity to the promises made to the ancestors. It is the oneness of God's purpose with Israel that the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is discussing. The fidelity becomes a burning issue under the vicissitudes of Israel's history without question. Because when a crisis comes, such as their crisis in Egypt, of course, then Israel is shown that God is true to his promises, his purposes, and his actions.